unleashing female power.
Being a disruptor.
I'm always constantly telling the truth.
I love
art. That's all her life.
She's alive and female.
Being a woman, what it meant.
Prove him wrong.
Girls run the world.
We're rocking the place.
Welcome to the Art Pod. I'm your host, Carolina, and I'll be your guide through this Pandora's box. Strap yourselves in for a journey through the art world where we bring you candid conversations, untold stories, uncover industry secrets, and celebrate the women who are shaping its future. Because in the Art Pod, the spotlight is always on the girls. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Art Pod. My guest today is Chrissie Iles. And she is the Annie and Joel Ehrenkranz curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So a little bit about Chrissie. She is British and born in Beirut, Lebanon. Her curatorial focus is contemporary art and moving image art of the 1960s and 1970s from a global perspective. Iles curated exhibitions include surveys of work of Louise Bourgeois, Dan Graham, Donald Judd, Paul McCartney, and Sharon Hayes, exhibitions by Colleen Smith, Kevin Everson, and Lorna Simpson, and 4 major thematic exhibitions of moving image art: Signs of the Times, British film, video, and slide installation in Britain in the 1980s, Scream and Scream Again, film and art, Into the Light, the projected image of American art 1964 to 1977, and Dreamland's immersive cinema and art 1905 to 2016. She co-curated the 2004 and 2006 Whitney Biennials and the current Whitney Biennial, Even Better Than the Real Thing. She publishes widely and is a member of the graduate committee of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and a faculty member of the School of Visual Arts curating program. She was awarded an honorary doctorate in the history of art by Bristol University, England, her alma mater, in 2015. A lot of accomplishments.
Thank you.
But I really want to get started with us talking a little bit about your role at the Whitney. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there, kind of what a day-to-day looks like for you?
Yes. So I'm one of the curators at the Whitney Museum, and I'm part of a team of curators who build the collection and create the exhibition program. So my role is to build the film and video part of our collection and also to make exhibitions. So I'm an exhibition maker and a scholar and a writer, and have been building the moving image part of our collection for quite some time. I do that in collaboration with my colleagues and with artists and outside scholars and other colleagues. So, it's a very collaborative department. It's a very close-knit department. We're in dialogue with each other daily. We have a new director, we have a new chief curator, and it's very dynamic.
That's lovely. Can you tell us a little bit more, because you mentioned acquisitions for the Whitney? Can you tell us a little bit about how that takes place, what your thought process is behind acquiring works for the Whitney collection?
Yes, I mean, a museum collection, it really, in the case of the Whitney, is about mapping histories and mapping art histories. And when you're building a collection, you're really giving curators of the future, say in 30 years' time or even 5 years' time, the tools to tell stories about the histories, plural, of American art. So I'm always thinking 300 years ahead.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because you have to, because, you're thinking in a very you're thinking about the long-term future for these works, and you're thinking about the care of them, and you're thinking about how these works are going to travel into the long-term future. Just as we look at a medieval painting now or something from the 19th century, and you really look at them in new ways from the perspective of now. So how are these works going to be understood, and how is this moment in American culture and art history and history going to be understood in the long-term future? So all those things are what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how to map those histories. The moving image is a very important part of the history of American art. Artists of all over the world have picked up the moving and still camera from its invention, even painters and artists working in ways that you wouldn't have thought had anything to do with the moving image. The moving image, the camera, is a kind of tool for experimentation, and it's a way in which artists expand their thinking. And so, and then for some artists, it becomes their central practice. So, what I do is build a collection by thinking, okay, how is the history or histories of American art, how are they being mapped out by all of us in different mediums? And how can I address areas that maybe others or other mediums are not looking at? So, for example, one thing we're working on now is the histories of queer Black artists in America in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's not very visible, and there are many reasons for that. So I'm working with one of my students from CCS Bard, who is my intern this summer, Omar, who is doing incredible research and making an exhibition of his own. So mentorship and scholarly dialogue is very important. So what Omar and I are working on and having a dialogue about will have an impact on the collection, just to give you an example, and fill a very important gap in really discovering certain things that maybe were not so visible before, and making sure they're included in those histories. Latinx art, Asian art, indigenous art. So, unfolding those histories from the past and bringing them in to the present to ensure that they have a role in telling stories about history for the future is what my role is, and what all of our roles are in building the collection.
It's interesting because obviously, for major museums like this, the collections tended to lean heavily on white male artists. And I feel like there's a big shift now taking place in how curators are really, um, considering shifting into like things that have not been so present in the collections and building it for the future generations. So just the way that you described everything that you're thinking about is so critical at this moment.
Yes, I mean, the majority of art has always been created by people in the global South. And I think that the history of American art and the history of America itself has really skewed things in a very particular way. History is a process. History is always being rewritten. So I've been working on this personally for about 12 years. The acceleration of this over a broader cultural sphere in relation to museums, I think, is generational as well. I think that we're seeing a big generational shift to a much more diverse, much younger generation who are really engaged in these questions and ideas and rethinking what was a much smaller, very male-dominated, white male-dominated art world before. And so we're in the midst of a huge sea change. And so the collection is really mapping that and paying attention to that. The other thing that that I do is that I don't bring in moving image works to the collection just through the gallery system. I mean, the gallery system is great, but it's only one part of the way in which works exist. And so with moving image, some moving image works, especially historical, exist in film archives or in a box in the studio of the artist. So you can't map an art history by what the galleries are choosing. You work with them for the things they're choosing to focus on, and then you also look at the other aspects of art history, or the present for that matter, that the galleries aren't focusing on, and then you bring them all together. And so that kind of very broad approach also enables us to represent a history in a much more accurate way, if you like, because we're bringing in maybe dance-related work or performance-related work that's, a lot of work doesn't go through the galleries. And, New Yorkers can be very parochial in the art world and very gallery-focused. Outside New York, not many people pay attention to New York, so it's also important to understand American art from that non-parochial perspective, and also from a global perspective. How do artists who are working here from all over the world contribute to these histories and those layered histories, and what does it mean to, for example, look at for example, what does it mean to look at the moving image from an Asian perspective,
Mhm.
where time operates differently, where the idea of the cinematic is extremely different from a white Western or European American, Euro American or
Mhm.
Anglo-Saxon perspective that's dominated by Hollywood. I mean, Bollywood is way bigger than Hollywood, for example. So, to also shift in our collection the emphasis away from falling into those traps.
And it's interesting because you work with the moving image and images, and that sort of medium is relatively contemporary. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about the thought behind really working with moving images and acquiring them for the Whitney collection, as opposed to, let's say, like paintings or sculptures, mediums that have been around for thousands of years?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the moving image camera was picked up by artists from the moment it was invented. So, the moving image in art is not new, it's well over 100 years old. And there's a big difference between film and video, even though these days they both might be on a digital format, let's
Mhm.
say. And so I think that people tend to call a film a video a film. And,
Yeah.
what is the cinematic? What is the cinematic now? It's very, very layered. And so, in thinking about the ways in which the moving image is both shown and collected for the museum's collection, it's really critical to think of space, the physical space of the museum, the physical space with which people, um, uh, in which people view the moving image.
Mhm.
So, for example, in our current biennial that I co-curated with Meg Only, Meg and I are both very engaged in the moving image as well as every other medium. And what you'll see in the biennial is every single room that has a moving image work in it, the artist has engaged often color, light, gels, sound, colored walls, colored carpet, very specific decisions, even seating, that really affect the way in which we receive the moving image, look at it, experience it. So, for example, Diane Severin Nguyen's In Her Time, there are pink and purple ribbons to the left and the right that create these walls. There's a huge daybed that people sprawl on. There's a red floor. And so the environment, and there's red gelled lights. So the environment contains the image, the moving image, and it's meant to suggest um, a movie set on a soundstage that then mirrors what's going on inside the film itself, which is all about the creation of a film about the Nanking Massacre and it's filmed on a soundstage in China. So the space that you were looking at, the moving image in, and what artists choose to create, to kind of construct that space, is very important as well. In other words, the moving image can be experienced in many different ways, one of which is through a kind of installation format,
Mhm.
which is one of the things that I'm most interested in. And installations, which also form a lot of the works in our biennial, is something that American artists have been very good at creating for the last 40 years. And yet the American art world, and especially the New York art world, are not that engaged in. So installations are an international kind of language of art making, but in museums you don't see them very often. It's all painting with a little bit of sculpture.
True.
And so that kind of, in a way, if you like, correction to the narrative, I think is very important,
Mhm.
because you can't build a history of art through a sort of market structure, because some of the most important works in art history cost nothing or very
Yeah.
little, just like some of the most important literature in the world and poetry in the world. I mean, you know, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It costs nothing. It costs $5 to buy a book of extraordinary poetry. So, to try and build an art history that is not dictated by the market is really crucial.
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on that. And I'm also glad that you brought up the Whitney Biennale, because this is your third one now, because you
Mhm.
co-curated the first two and now you co-curated this one with Meg Only also. Can we talk a little bit about what the concept was for those who haven't seen it yet? Kind of how you sourced the artists that you wanted to show for it. Just give us a little bit of the story behind it.
Sure. We came to the show with no preconceived idea of what it would be. We wanted to be open. We wanted to not bring ideas we'd been working on for previous possible shows to the table. We wanted to start with a blank sheet of paper and actually make a show that really addressed the present. I mean, the Whitney Biennial, there are about 300 biennials in the world. All of them are named after a place: the Berlin Biennial, Venice Biennale, Sao Paulo Biennial, Istanbul Biennial. The Whitney Biennial is the only biennial that's named after and cited in a museum and is very connected to that history. So there are certain things about the biennial. One is it's always in dialogue with previous biennials. You don't want to repeat something that's just been done. So, for example, the 2022 biennial, which was curated and opened in the middle of the pandemic, really looked at the borders, the southern border of the US. So we wouldn't go and revisit that as an idea, for example. So you're always in dialogue with previous biennials, Whitney biennials. You're also thinking about the collection, since the collection is built partly through the biennial, and also the history of the biennial and the institution, the fact that it's American art, or art made in America, the fact that it's pretty much art based over the last 2 years. I mean, it's pretty contemporary, although there's no fixed rule about that. And then a kind of desire to articulate current ideas. So it's like a sort of a snapshot of some of the work going on right now. What it isn't is some kind of best in show or top 50 young artists,
Yeah.
or all of that. We really stayed away from all of that. The Whitney's Biennial's never been all of that, and yet the very market-based art world in New York tends to sort of, want it to be that. And but the art fairs do that perfectly well, especially after the pandemic, where they worked quite successfully online. So, what we did was we did about 200 studio visits. We traveled around the country. We listened to artists. So we went on a listening tour, in effect. One of the things that was very clear is that some of the very young artists just simply weren't ready for a show like the Biennial. The pandemic had really knocked a lot of people sideways in practical as well as psychological ways. Another thing we noticed was a really strong engagement with ideas of materiality, of architectural space and the psychology of architectural space, a sense of interiority, of, lots of artists mentioned psychoanalysis, including many artists of color, and psychoanalysis in the past has sort of pathologized those communities, and now those communities are really engaging in psychoanalysis and rethinking it, which is really interesting, and that's very present in the show. The body and the vulnerability of the body, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the trans and queer body and the sort of vulnerability of that. Everyone's like, protect black trans women in 2020, but in 2024, how many people are still thinking about that? So, this sense of wanting to listen to artists and listen to what they were telling us and thinking about, and then how to bring that together in a show that felt coherent and not just an aggregation of great art, by young artists brought together in a random way, which is very easy to do because you're working so fast. So how to make something that felt coherent and also meaningful. So what we did was we decided to reduce the number of artists and pare down the number of artists on each floor, and to also focus on installations which don't tend to get focused on so much. And what you'll see in the show is also a number of installations that were commissioned elsewhere, and then we're bringing them together in relation to each other. So, for example, Lotus Kang's in Cascades was commissioned by Chisenhale Gallery in London by Zoe Whately. Madeline Hunter-Ehrlich's Too Bright to See, about the Martinican poet and thinker in the 1930s, Suzanne Césaire, was commissioned by PAM, Paris Art Museum in Miami. And Clarissa Tossin's installation, Before the Volcanoes Sing, was commissioned by MPAC. There are a number of P staffs. Afferent Nerves was shown in their survey exhibition at Kunsthalle Basel last summer. And so, when you really look around at some of these big installations, they were, Konstantina Zavatsanos' piece was shown in a different form in Participant in New York. You see ways in which these works are brought together from all over the world. Diane Severin-Nguyen's piece that I mentioned was commissioned by the Rockbund Museum in China. We're bringing works from China, London, Basel, Miami, together in one place, in dialogue with each other. Ligia Lewis's film. Ligia Lewis is a wonderful young choreographer and dancer based in Berlin. And this is her first film and her first museum showing. And the film was commissioned by Cara, who are our colleagues. Cara, wonderful space not far from us. And we said, would you mind if we re-showed your piece? Because they just did a show of Ligia, and they said, absolutely. And we used their carpet, we reused their carpet. And so this bringing together of works from elsewhere, which is almost like a film festival model in a way, because you're showing people things that they, most people don't go to Venice. Most people don't go to travel. They don't have the resources to travel. And even if the small number of professionals who do, you can't see everything. So the research is also for the purpose not only of being in artist studios, but also seeing other works that artists have made through opportunities they've had all over the world, which in some cases is much more kind of supported than they can find here, and then bringing them all together in this dialogue. So in the show, for example, what you find as a result is a really interesting interconnection between works, which became more and more evident as we built the show, and even after the show had opened. Because the other thing to mention is we commissioned 10 new works for the show. Excuse me, major new works, one of which is Eddie Adolfo Apariccio's big amber sculpture that has fallen apart. But, when we looked at the show and installed it and started really thinking about it once it was up, one of the things that's very striking is these larger arcs of history that young artists are looking at. So it's very grounded in the 1930s. So you have, for example, Eddie Aparicio embedded facsimiles of archival documents related to an indigenous massacre in El Salvador in the 1930s. Eddie's family is from El Salvador. Diane's piece addresses the Nanking Massacre in China in the 1930s. Madeline Hunter-Ehrlich looking at Suzanne Césaire in Martinique and those very important cultural moments in the 30s that have been really overlooked. And then Isaac Julian looking at Langston Hughes in the 30s and Barthet and Alan Locke, the Harlem Renaissance philosopher. So the 1930s is everywhere in this show in ways that become increasingly evident when you look at the relationships between works and how they're talking to each other about that moment globally.
No, I mean, I really love the fact that you focused on a smaller amount of artists, because it really, I mean, for me personally, when I saw the show, it really opened my eyes to a lot of artists that I wasn't familiar with, and I saw how each of the works spoke to each other. And me personally, as a woman, the concept of the body, the policing of women's bodies was very prevalent in the show. And it just, I feel like the works themselves in the show really spoke to each other really well, and the concept that you just described. So for me, I really loved it. But thank you for talking a little bit about the Whitney Biennale. I had another question. When you plan things like the Whitney Biennale, how different is it doing something like that as opposed to curating an exhibition?
It's very different because you're reacting very much in the present. You have
Mhm.
to be able to work fast and work slowly at the same time, meaning that you have to be able to respond quickly. And you have to trust your instincts a lot, and you have to bring all your experience and all your, in a way, community connections and all your understanding and listening skills together uh, in a very sort of compacted period of time. Um, so one reason I invited Meg to curate the show with me is that I know that she um, can do that, and I know it from observing her great curatorial work in the past, and also from the dialogue we've had together over the last several years. During the pandemic, we would call each other every Friday afternoon and talk
Mhm.
for a couple of hours about art and curating and how do we really wanted to work together. So you have to bring to a project like this also. I mean, most of my friends are artists, but they're not in the exhibition, and
Mhm.
so you have to also put any personal connections aside with artists and be very really focused on the um, on the whole, on the exhibition as a whole, and the relationship between things. So what you're doing is making those interconnections as you're doing the studio visits and thinking about not only just a list of great young artists, but also what makes sense in this particular framework and for this particular situation. So, for example, the more artists were talking about the body, then P staff talking about the netting in their installation in the biennial, which is like the nervous system almost being splayed
Mhm.
over our heads in the sense of literally. I mean, the piece is called afferent nerves of sort of um, heightened anxiety and danger, and then Jess Fan's draping of almost like the exoskeleton, the relationship between the interior and exterior, in relation to then P, and then in turn that in relation to say Ingrid Bielsen or others, where um, you start to make connections between these works and between what these artists are thinking in your head. Otherwise, you might as well just have an art fair,
Yeah, true.
and so you have to be able to kind of make those interconnections fast,
Mhm.
and also the reading you do. Someone said to us, "Oh, you're not going to have any time for reading or research," and Meg and I looked at each other and went, because that's how we make shows. So uh, we did read and we did research, and there were certain books that were really important to us as we were working. So we read a lot, we thought a lot, we had a lot of discussions and dialogue with each other. And now that happens if you do any thematic show, if you're making the show with someone else. But normally, uh, those ideas evolve over a much longer period of time. So it's about the ability to act quickly,
Mhm.
but not superficially, that I think really distinguishes this biennial and all biennials. Because if you think about it, every single biennial, by the nature of it being a biennial,
Yep.
is done in 11 months.
Mhm.
Cecilia Alemani's Venice Biennale was different because she had double the time. And it showed in the amount of research that her researchers and she were able to do and build, and the historical pods of these themes. I
Mhm.
mean, maybe all biennials should be triennials now that,
Yeah.
there are so many. And, that would give you a little more time. And at the same time, things move really fast. So we had the list and the show laid out floor by floor, because we have to, have it all budgeted and also designed in terms of the layout
Mhm.
by early September, for example. So,
Wow.
you know, even if you have one more year, you're still you're still working fast, and also one more year. How what would it mean to then talk about the present when you're making decisions that are maybe grounded in a year and a half rather than 11 months?
Mhm.
So, it would change the nature of the show a little bit.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
can
an
imagine.
interesting question.
Yeah, because I 11 months for that size of a show is incredible. And it's an incredible amount of work to do. And I mean, it's for those of us who worked for a museum, we know how this kind of works, but it's really a short amount of time to put on that type of exhibition. For the other exhibitions that you've previously worked on, which were met with critical acclaim, a lot of them, how long do you normally like to give yourself to build these exhibitions?
It really depends on the show.
Mhm.
I've done survey shows, Louise Bourgeois, etc., and I've done a lot of thematic shows. It really depends. Some shows take longer to research than others, and it also depends on, for example, with the biennial, we invited the artists, and at the same time as you're inviting the artists, you're inviting some of them to make new work.
Mhm.
Now, I just want to mention our we call it B24 team, because Meg and I are the ones who, as curators, get the most attention. But in fact, it's a deeply collaborative process between not only us and the artists, but our entire team. Many of whom are artists themselves. I mean, all our installers are artists. There is huge amounts of problem solving that happen together as a group with the artist. So endless Zooms where we talk back and forth with our head of our registrars, our head of exhibition design, and her team, the sort of carpentry and exhibition structure and construction. There's so many conversations and details that get decided by the artist with all of us, not just Meg and I, and the problem solving and the teamwork is key. So one of the key things when you're working very fast is your ability to work as a team with a team, and to be, in a way, the bridge between the artists and the team.
Mhm.
And that's the case with every show, every single show. And the really important thing is that you have your team with you and that you are part of that team, and you can feel it in the show,
Mhm.
whichever show it is, whether
Yeah.
it's a biennial or any show. And that is really the joy of curating for me, is working with the team.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm sure, because it's like there's a difference between doing a studio visit with an artist and seeing a work and going like, this would be great for the Whitney Biennale, and then the work is brought on site, and then you have all these other logistical things like where to place it, as in conversation with another work, how will this work look in this particular space. There's so many different works in the Whitney Biennale that are, like you mentioned, the netting. Then there's like Nikita Gale, who had the piano in its own room, which I really
Mhm.
love that work. Then you had the work that, literally disintegrated over time. So
Mhm.
these works, some of them are extremely fragile. I can't even imagine like the logistical nature of, putting something like this together with like the registrars, the installers, and everything like that.
And also our AV team. I mean, Nikita's piece, for example, has a lighting designer
Mhm.
we worked with. I mean, that was made, we commissioned that for the show. It's a specially made work with a lighting designer. The sound, so that the benches are haptic, they have transducers.
Oh yeah.
And so the lighting, the transducers, it was such a complicated piece technically. Our entire team, including our electricians, including our head of the David, who looks after the infrastructure of the museum and all the kind of electricity. There's so many aspects. Each piece is almost like a show in itself, a
Yeah.
small solo show. And so the different teams and how they work together with the artist, especially when new works are being made, like Eddie's amber work, we had to build a structure to contain the amber because it was moving like a plant
Mhm.
towards the light, and it was this big structure. And 10 of us met daily around it to discuss it, to make sure it was not about to collapse. It did
Mhm.
eventually collapse, which it's meant to do, but there's an immense care over the entire period of the show that happens. We're in there every day once it opens. And that's true with every show. And the team aspect is something that I've always loved and is really at the heart of exhibition making. Otherwise, some exhibitions you see them and they're actually books.
Yes.
And what distinguishes a show from a book is the physical space and the articulation of the physical space you're in as the viewer. And when I come in on a Friday night when there are 5,000 people in the building, because it's Free Fridays, and it gives me huge pleasure to just see people exploring for the first time the different works and discovering them, seeing them in relation to each other. And we thought a lot about sightlines. You see from one point on the 6th floor, P's yellow room, and then Diane's red room, and in between Carmen's grid of photographs. So you're looking at these sightlines all the time. Meg and I spent a huge amount of time on sightlines, and sightlines and install are very important for both of us.
I feel like visitors don't even consider these things. Obviously, you wouldn't until you really work in a museum or gallery space or just around art when you consider these sorts of things like sightlines. But it's the little things that I feel like make the difference when putting together such a huge exhibition. And honestly, I was just sad that I wasn't there for the day when Eddie's sculpture collapsed because I was waiting to see that. But I saw it on Instagram. And it looked great. For things like the Whitney Biennale, when you work with these, young artists, how do you ever acquire works from shows like that
Yes.
into the collection?
Yes. We've just acquired Diane Severin-Nagoyan's piece. We're acquiring Isaac Julian's installation, Madeline Hunt-Ehrlich's installation. We acquired Saber Calfuqueo's Tre Tre Co. Video installation. We acquire quite a few works from the show for the collection. It depends from show to show, because again, you're not acquiring just a bunch of great works. We're building art histories, as I mentioned. So, how can we tell those stories? And what sometimes an artist might make something that makes sense for a biennial or a show, but for the collection, it makes more sense to acquire something else, because that something else can just make more sense in terms of the unfolding of art histories or the particular moment in their career. So it's a discussion that takes place between the biennial curators and the curators responsible for building the collection. And we have long meetings and discussions, and we decide which works make sense, which works make sense to maybe not be acquired, but maybe another one from that artist. But, it also complements works we might bring in by another artist who's not in the biennial, because maybe they'll be in a biennial in 5 years' time. Maybe they'll never be in a biennial, but, we've got their work in the collection, maybe more than someone who was in a biennial. So, it's a complex, layered procedure, but it's all about laying out those histories and really building them slowly.
What would you say is the biggest challenge of your role at the Whitney?
The biggest challenge, I would say, is time, space, and money.
Okay, so everything.
Like everything in life, it would always be great to have more funding to buy more works of art for the collection, but we raise money, and especially for the moving image. That's also what I do. Time to develop shows, and also write, and space just to have more space to show more of the collection, especially moving image works that require rooms. I'd say another challenge for me building the collection is my biggest nightmare is in 20 years' time, all the moving image works that I brought in will be shown on a flat screen with headphones.
Which
that would be my biggest nightmare, that
Okay.
everyone ignores the instructions and just so again, team building and teamwork is key. So we have a time-based media team once the works enter the collection, and we really lay out with the artist very strict parameters. Like this is the minimum the projection should be. This is the maximum. It can't be 50 feet high and it can't be 2 feet. It's like, what does this mean to look after this piece if we can't protect it? This, by the way, is not limited to just moving image installations. For example, with a Donald Judd work, it's not written down anywhere that you shouldn't hang a painting behind a Judd sculpture, for example, or a floor work. But for Judd, that blank wall is part of the work. Well, I know that because I worked with him and did his last retrospective with a European museum, but that's not written down anywhere.
Yeah.
So, no one says you can't, it's not written down that you can't hang a painting 10 feet high. And so, when you have curatorial conceits, and sometimes certain curators will take works of art and then do what they will with them, how far is that okay? And what sort of parameters should you be putting in place to protect the artwork into the long-term future? For example, in an installation, it seems very obvious that you wouldn't put another artwork inside the same room, but not to all curators.
Yeah.
So we're constantly revisiting with the artist and amongst ourselves, what should we add to the notes? What should we add? You can't just acquire a work and then it's in the archive and all the instructions are there and then you move on. We are constantly in dialogue with the artist and with each other, updating. For example, I was in Rome Airport the other day and there was a screen in the cafe. It was a big screen and it was transparent. And I thought, looks very cool. A lot of commercial stuff on it, looked great. Well, if transparent screens are in the commercial world, they will follow soon after the domestic situation and then artists. Yeah. So is it okay to have artists work on a transparent screen? Maybe, maybe not. So then you have to go and ask the artist, all the artists that. And then with access, which is very important to Meg and I and is very built into our biennial from the get-go, what about captioning? And so when that began to be discussed, I said, well, let's not just default captioning. Let's talk to each artist and ask, well, how would you like to deal with access? Some artists say, yeah, captioning's fine. Others say, you know what, I'd like the captioning on a separate monitor on the floor. Artists that can then be involved in that process and in that updating as we develop and grow. So that's also the work of, building a collection. It's not just the acquiring of the work, which we do in sort of non-colonial ways. It's more like building this archive, but how do you take care of it? And how do you make sure also then that ideas go into the future in ways that don't stifle them, but also ensure that we're not working in a kind of neoliberal, hyper-capitalist, there's no past, only the present mentality where everything starts to look the same.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned technology and this equipment that these works require, because as we all know, technology moves incredibly fast and things get released, let's say, what happens if an artist has this list of specifications and, for example, this is a work made on a TV screen that then no longer is made 20 or 30 years from now. What then?
Well, we deal with that all the time. For example, Nam June Paik's Magnet TV from 1965, there's a big magnet on top of a TV set. And you move it around and you change the image, which at the time was impossible to change. If Nixon was on TV, that was it. Well, it would be before Nixon, but JFK, whatever was on TV with a speech. Or any news, or anything. So if you moved the magnet around, at the time it was quite radical. You then could change what CBS or these other corporate TV corporations were giving you. Now it's too delicate to do that because you might break the TV, the magnet might fall on someone's foot, it's huge. What do you do? Well, maybe we make an exhibition copy. So we make an exhibition copy in which we replicate the work. And so you can move the magnet and experience it. So that raises the question, where does the meaning of the piece lie? Does it lie in that 1965 old-looking TV set, which was, of course, in 1965 not old at all, but looked pretty radical and new?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it in the act of being able to change the image from the outside? So those kind of philosophical and conceptual questions, sometimes we are able to ask them and discuss them with the artist if the artist is still alive. Sometimes in the case of Pike, who's no longer with us, we have to work together and with the foundation and discuss that and come to a conclusion, and also be transparent in the label. This is what we're doing. This is why we decided to do it. What you're looking at is an exhibition copy. It's like a thought experiment. And that also brings the visitor into the conversation too. It's like, oh, well, interesting. I'll try this. And maybe you put them side by side. So it's constantly evolving. We are also talking with our replication committee, which I'm part of, about these questions all the time. Carol Mancusi-Ngaro, our past head of conservation, established the replication committee to deal with questions of making an exhibition copy. What are the philosophical, practical, and ethical questions involved in doing that? Sometimes someone's making a movie and they want, one of our paintings, they want to make a reproduction of it for the movie set. Sometimes it's an exhibition copy because the original is too fragile. All these questions we deal with internally in discussion with each other, with members from different departments within the museum: legal, registrar, reproduction rights, curatorial, etc.
So we spoke about all the challenges, which there are many. Can you tell us some of the highs that you love about your job?
For me, the huge pleasure is working with artists and with the team. Those two things, and being in dialogue with the artists, and also being able to see the artworks over and over again every day, is just a huge pleasure. When I walk into work, I see right in front of me a Norman Lewis painting from 1965. I see J. DeFeo's The Rose. I see the Biennial several times a day, every day, and all the works in there. And you get to rethink what you thought you knew about a work by being around the artworks every day and really taking them in. I think that attention span is a huge issue now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
It always was, but it really
Thanks
is
to
now.
social media.
Yeah. So, the challenge and also the joy is figuring out how to spend your own time with artworks in your own museum and others, but also figuring out ways to maybe encourage people to be present with the art and really slow down and think and be and just take time and put your shoulders down and walk more slowly in the space and just be in a different environment to this very rushed, very transactional kind of environment, which is increasingly feels like the carousel is spinning faster and faster. And so how do you enter into a show in which there's a certain quietude, and then that can lead you into whatever the artist is trying to tell you, even if the work itself might be quite noisy.
Yeah.
How do you just shift people's perceptions and open up possibilities for people to experience the world and what artists are saying in a meaningful way? That's the real joy to me, is figuring out how to do that.
Yeah, every time I come to the Whitney, one of my first stops is always J. DeFeo's work, and every time I see it, I see something else in it, and the little crevices and just yeah. The other day I was actually talking to somebody. We were talking about how long people tend to spend looking at a work of art, and they mentioned that the statistic now is like 3 seconds, which I found absolutely crazy, but I guess it makes sense now with social media and people's attention spans going to the wayside. But I think, with art, I think the more time you spend with it, the more you discover about it. And, as you change as a person, your view of that artwork might also change as well.
Well, sometimes you can encourage people to spend more time with artworks by doing very practical things. Like, for example, giving people more time to sit, like simply putting more seating
Yeah.
around so that you're in the space rather than going for a walk.
Mhm.
I was in the British Museum in London a couple of weeks ago, and there were no benches anywhere. Now, apart from access questions, I wanted to just sit with something,
Yeah.
and I couldn't. So if you want to spend more than 3 seconds, you have to stand. And if you have to stand, but everyone's moving around, you feel like you're an obstruction
Yeah.
to the next person, especially if it's a show where there are a lot of people. So the psychology of how people operate in space as a group of visitors is very, very important, and something that I think about all the time. Like,
Mhm.
what does it mean to put a bench here? And then what happens if you then, and that's true with all public space, by the way. I mean, it's really something interesting to think about, that we are constantly scrolling in our heads. Even before social media appeared, our eyes are moving around. How can you embody people in space? How can you make people just feel also that they're not on display? So sometimes the way you put a bench somewhere, if you put it in the middle of the room, people may not like it because people don't like exposing their backs to other people who might be behind them. Maybe you put it against a wall. Maybe so you really start to maybe shift very subtly the going for a walk and walking around objects, passing by them for 3 seconds, to something that feels safe to be in for more than 3 seconds.
Mhm.
So it's not just the people and their attention span, it's actually also the atmosphere of the room, the opportunities to be in the room other than walking, and then how people relate to each other and other bodies in space.
No, I'm glad that you actually brought up that point because I noticed this when I was, working at the museum also. Um we had the same problem in the beginning where like all the gallery spaces were empty. No seating or anything, and people tended to fly through them. And then we realized that once we started putting seating into these spaces, people would spend more time with the artworks. So I feel like that is an incredibly interesting concept to really also consider, it is the body in the space and accessibility and things like that.
And once you gather people in a space and you have something that feels also not even like a bench, but almost like something like a day bed or
Yeah.
something, when you're really almost like the equivalent of people lying on the grass, or being in a park on the grass, leaning against a tree, sitting around together. What does it mean for people to be in that kind of situation, but in a museum?
Yeah.
And with a painting, especially when there are sort of 4 angles of viewing for a painting. One is from a distance,
Hmm.
right in front of it. One is medium. One is close up, like when people look to see the brush marks, or
That's me.
and then the 4th one is to the side. In a way, that the way something's a painting is by looking at the edge of it, and that's where you go, right, that's it, unconsciously, you're like,
Mhm.
that's canvas stretched across a stretcher. And then of course artists and painters are busy undoing that and doing
Yeah.
everything that they've been doing for the last 100 years to question that. But those 4 viewing points, you can't get to any of them except one of them if you sit on a bench looking at it.
Yeah.
So how do you what does that mean? And what would happen if you had a big day bed in the middle of a room of paintings, for example? You usually have it with projections, but projections and painting are very similar to each other.
Mhm.
Painters and filmmakers are really approaching things from a very similar way. So I don't know, what does it mean to be then to go close up to something? It's really interesting to also think about haptic approaches to the experience of a painting in relation to the painter who painted it, because a painter is a very physical activity making a painting, and the painter can be either working very close up on something or making some large gesture, and the very physical activity of making the painting. What does it mean for a viewer to then just look at the final result? Is there a way to think about drinking in that painting, standing up and sitting down, without obscuring other people's view? And it's almost like the choreographing of space and the
Mhm.
choreographing of the paintings within the space and the people in relation to the paintings. How to do that. There was a show that's just up at the moment at the Beiler Foundation in Basel, curated by Tuna Segal and others. And there are some paintings from the collection that are abutting each other. There are two Van Goghs, two Hodelin landscapes, all hung slightly above the normal hanging height and with no space between them, and then a Max Ernst painting with a moonscape, and then at the end a Wolfgang Tillmans photograph, all in one long frieze.
Wow.
And you look at the Van Goghs, and then you look at the Hodelins, and Hodelin really holds up in relation to Van Gogh. And it makes you look at the Hodelin in a different way. If there'd been the usual gap between one painting and another, it would have been much less intimate somehow.
Mhm.
So some potentially pretentious, but actually very successful, radical rehang of a group of works can really make you see things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So the presentation of artworks in physical space is crucial. And a lot of emphasis these days is maybe placed on theory or ideas, and that's great, but that's again the book. But there's nothing in the space except you and the work. So how does the embodied experience of seeing artworks unfold, and how can you really bring new perspectives to that? That requires you to really understand physical space and then translate that physical space into something that viewers with a very distracted attention span, looking at their phones, talking to each other, how do you even get them to stop talking a little bit just so they can look, even for those 3 seconds, in ways that are not kind of intrusive, but open up new ideas.
Yeah. You know, that reminded me immediately of the work that you have in the Whitney Biennial, and I forget the artist's name, so please tell me. It's this installation of films. They're black and white, and then the benches are towards the wall, so you can sit, but you can also walk through the space, so you can view the films from different angles. But normally, if there were no benches, for example, in that space, I would have spent a lot less time looking at the work. Whereas because you had these benches, and I saw people also sitting for a really long time, really thoroughly watching the whole longevity of the installation.
What you're talking about is Isaac Julian's video installation. Once again, Statues Never Die. And that installation has 5 large screens that go down to the ground, 5 sculptures, and 5 mylar walls, and they're all placed in at different angles. So, and then there's grey walls, grey carpet, and then the benches against the walls, as you mentioned. So when you walk in, what you see is, again, the way Isaac has choreographed our movement around the space. So those 5 benches, sculptures, screens, mylar walls are showing you on the screens 3 stories that are interwoven. And so what you have is this very immersive embodied experience of a story that unfolds in 3 parts. And the sculptures in the space also appear in the films.
Yeah.
And every part of the physical space that you're in is also integrated. So I think one of the reasons that work is so successful, apart from the very high quality of the filmmaking itself, is the conceptual rigor and clarity of that. And so, in a sense, what you have, those screens are almost like paintings.
Yes.
And there are drawings and paintings within them. They have sculptures in the films and also in the space. And then you see each other, the different viewers, as people move through and then sit. So there's many moments in the screens where you see people filmed, all in black and white, moving through museum spaces. In one moment, a curator is moving through the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and another filmmaker who made You Hide Me. There's an excerpt from that film from 1971 in one screen, or a couple of the screens, where the filmmaker himself is standing inside the British Museum with his friend, unpacking and unpacking art objects from African objects from the British Museum, because that film, and then Isaac's piece as well, is arguing for the restitution of African objects. And so you, as the viewer, are the same size as all those people who appear in the film, be it Alan Locke, the Harlem Renaissance philosopher, Barthet, the sculptor. You and they are the same height. So it's almost like you're also walking through that corridor behind them, or you're looking at them in the Pitt Rivers. So the way in which physical space and filmed space and sculptural space are integrated within that room is quite extraordinary and very musical, actually. And so that really embodies some of the questions that I was mentioning earlier, I think, and why it's so successful.
Yeah, 100%. That was actually one of the works on view in the Biennale that I think I spend the most time with. Really, really incredible work. But speaking about that, I also wanted to ask you, before we move on to everything else in your life, how do you factor in social and global events into the way that you conceive shows? Because obviously the Whitney Biennale had a lot of that in it, which most people might not even realize.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has been very surprising to us is how some of the press and the articles that we've read about the show have just said it's not political, or it's too polite, or it's very beautiful, or something. And it's really interesting. It's like, well, there are wars, massacres, histories, the body, the unsafety of the body, there's so much in the show. What we wanted to do in the show is talk about different interwoven ideas without the show being agitprop in a very direct way, because we have that on our phones, and we have that very efficiently on our phones, information about what's going on in the world, which changes hourly, let alone daily. So how can you make a show that talks about the condition of living in that situation, and complements what you're looking at when you might literally sit on a bench taking a rest from what you've just seen, and there pops up on your phone the reality, which is shifting constantly. So what about the condition of also living in America? Because America is a very kind of experimental, it's like a social experiment, a huge social experiment, America, and it's a very open place, which is its strength and its weakness. And so, I think one of the critiques of the show is like, oh, do we really need to know that America's falling apart yet again? It's like, well, if you're making a show about American art in the last 2 years, this is what artists are talking about. I mean, when we went to New Orleans, for example, there are buildings that haven't been repaired since Hurricane Katrina 20 years ago. There are conditions of dire poverty across the US. There are, 50 million people below the poverty line. There's homelessness at record levels. When we went to Oakland, the potholes were so large, the residents are drawing big red circles around them to warn each other because their cars were getting wrecked. And by cars, I don't mean affluent cars, I'm just the local community.
Yeah.
So America is falling apart
It
in
is.
so many ways,
and people live in that.
Yeah, and so the condition of being in America, the way in which the healthcare system fails, particularly Black women, is everywhere in the exhibition, especially on the 6th floor. It's again not in your face, but it's there. And this sense that people want to be told something very directly is very naive to me, because you know there are many layers to artworks. Artists don't work in that obvious way.
Yeah.
They work in much more layered and subtle ways, and sometimes the work may not be for you. It may be for other communities that you're not part of, so respect that. And when we were in dialogue with Lygia Lewis, as we were making the show, Lygia became a kind of interlocutor for us. She said, "Oh, it sounds like you're building a dissonant chorus of voices, and then you are placing the audience in the middle of that chorus." So that became something we ended up putting in the intro text, because she was right. And, the show is very much about that, and about how to be together in a very fractious moment, how to talk to each other, how to talk to people you dramatically disagree with. We have to be able to talk to each other. We have to be able to coexist. What does that mean to do that? And that sounds very Pollyanna-ish, but it's really true. It's about civics, and it's about how to build community in an increasingly individualistic society, which America has been hurtling
Yes.
into ever since the 80s, ever more kind of intensely, and also from a global perspective. What we do affects the rest of the world, economically, politically. What does it mean to have responsibility, to be responsible, and to actually have responsibility for other people?
Yeah.
And so the show talks about that. And so, I think America is in this constant state of change, and it's such a fiction.
Yes.
And the exposure of the fictions that are America is so increasingly prevalent because of social media and because of the way in which people can communicate. It actually makes the addressing of that really, to us, essential.
Yeah. I'm not even going to go too into depth about the failure of the American healthcare system, because that's a podcast all on its own. But I do want to mention one insane statistic that I actually read before I even saw the show, which is the high mortality rates of women giving birth in a first world country, which is America. And especially that of women of color, which is absolutely insane for a country like America, with the type of healthcare that, we can give to people, but we don't. And I feel like the show, the Whitney Biennial, also touched on that as well, which I feel like is really something that's incredibly important and that more people need to be aware of.
Very much. I mean, a sculpture like Julia Phillips' Nourisher, made just after she gave birth to her first child, the tubes that pool at the bottom are very much in reference to the failure of the health system, especially for Black women, and especially during childbirth. Carolyn Lazard's new sculpture made for the show is on first glance in dialogue with American minimalist sculpture from the 60s, a white male, works like, say, Robert Morris's Mirror Cubes from 1966. And then you look more closely, and the piece is made of medicine cabinets. And, Carolyn said, well, you can tell a lot about someone from looking inside their medicine cabinet, but they don't allow us to look inside the medicine cabinet. What's there instead is Vaseline, that opacity, the symbolism of that opacity, of that refusal to look inside, but also the what the Vaseline represents in terms of, again, the failure of the healthcare system in America for the Black community especially, and the way in which the Vaseline, I mean, there is a myriad ways in which that Vaseline just speaks volumes about that, and the medicine cabinets, and then that relationship also to corporate architecture, and the health system, the education system. It's just it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Mind-boggling, and that's everywhere in the show. A work like Carmen Winant's The Last Safe Abortion, which is a very large photographic gridded piece, wall piece, which is a work of photographs taken from 10 archives of women's reproductive health clinics across the Midwest, many of which have now closed following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Every woman in that grid of photographs gave their permission to be shown. Because many of those clinics have now closed, the archives become this map of the healthcare system in America, the support for women, the majority of whom are of color, by those clinics, and the fact that, you know, if you took away large numbers of those photographs representing the closure of those clinics, what do those women have as support structures?
Exactly.
And so, you know, it's been very moving to present that work, and it's now come into the collection to actually see women who are coming to the grid and sometimes seeing themselves, sometimes recognizing others. And there are speakers in there about healthcare, women's healthcare and support. There are all kinds of women in that grid who collectively have created this support system, which has been just stripped away.
Yeah, that work really hit me hard when I saw it. One, because it's extremely large, but just after Roe versus Wade and everything that we had to, as women, endure in this country, and I can't even imagine, especially, you know, women of color and in these, you know, impoverished regions where access to safe abortions are no longer viable. That work was, I feel like, was incredibly timely.
Yeah. Yes, and it moves everyone who sees it, and then you move into another space where Harmony Hammond's work. I mean, there are 4 very recent paintings. Harmony, a lesbian feminist artist working since the 70s, addressing the body since that period too. Those works are also referring to the body and the unsafety of the body in the contemporary moment. And so when you look at that and you go from those paintings to Julia's sculpture to Diane's The Women in the Nanking Massacre, then Carmen, and, you know, these interconnections, and P with unsafety of the trans woman. And then there's a lot of interconnections between works that really talk to the present moment in a very kind of powerful way.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. Okay, so before we backtrack through your career, I just want to tell my listeners to go see the Whitney Biennale before it closes. What's the last day of
The
it?
last day for both floors being up is August the 11th.
Okay.
And then the 5th floor will come down because we're going to install a show called Edges of Ailey about the dancer and choreographer Alvin Ailey. And then the 6th floor will remain up until mid-September.
Okay. So you have some time during the summer. Go see it before it comes down. It's a really great show. And now I want to talk a little bit about you. So let's backtrack to the very beginning, which is your studies at Bristol University in England. Can you tell us a little bit about what you studied and whether your studies informed what you ended up doing? I assume so, because I believe you studied, what was it, art history?
I did a joint honors degree in political history and the history of art.
Okay.
And I focused on medieval art and Renaissance. I didn't study anything after 1750.
Wow. So very different from what you're doing now.
Yes and no. Yes
Okay.
and no. I mean, to me, it's very interconnected. I'm always thinking 3,000 years behind and 300 years ahead. And we are at this particular moment within history, but it's a very small blip. And everything that came in the last sort of 5,000 years culturally is informing how we are today. Everything from money to the economic systems to colonialisms, plural. I mean, there's a lot you can learn from history.
So after you finished your studies, you went on to work at the Waterloo Gallery and Studios. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was and kind of what you did there?
Yes. When I was at Bristol University, there's a place in Bristol which is a little bit like maybe the New Museum crossed with Artist Space, or maybe the Walker Art Center. Arnolfini was a gallery space, a cinema is a gallery space, a cinema, and to a certain extent a theatre, so maybe a little bit like the ICA in London. And I went there not being that exposed to contemporary art, and was very excited by what I saw there and became a volunteer there as a gallery attendant. And then at weekends, and then I decided I wanted to work with artists, because the artists I started to meet there made me realize that much as I loved art history, I really wanted to work with contemporary art. So I went to London after I finished university and did a postgrad diploma in what's now curating, but at the time was called arts administration.
Okay.
Which was focused much more on practical things like bookkeeping, crating, shipping, all those things, legal issues, than sort of conceptual ideas around curating. And I decided that I really wanted to work directly with artists. And I came upon something called the Waterloo Gallery and Studios, which is a big warehouse near what's now Tate Modern. And there were many artist studios there with a huge space in the middle, and the artists were curating the space. And in a very bold way, age 21, not knowing what I was doing, I said to the artist, "Can I run the space? I will raise my salary," which I did. And they said, "Sure." And so I had a little room next to their studios. It was completely unheated, so freezing in the winter. And I just started showing their work, other people's work, and just plunging in, basically. It was very rough and ready. It was, a big raw space. One of the shows we did was there's a British band called Wire, and they collaborated with Brian Eno, and they made this show where they literally stretched wires from the floor to the ceiling at different angles, and you moved through the space and you moved the wires and created sound, basically like a composition. And that very early exposure to an installation like that, which was, really very involved the entire space, is maybe one of the reasons why I've always been interested in installation, because I could see from the very get-go how artists were thinking, and painters were also very interested in the dialogue that was taking place in this very holistic way that doesn't reflect the way in which museums then make these artificial distinctions between mediums, whereas artists don't think like that. They're always talking to each other, and whether it's in art school or beyond. And so I wanted to kind of be in the middle of all that, and also then reflect that in my curating. I then, that place closed because it was owned by the council, the local council, who wanted to demolish the building, which they did, and build something else. So I looked for a new space, and I spent a year going around the East End and Hackney looking for a new space for the artists and our gallery. But they were all only short term. It's for you can have this space for a year and a half. So at this moment of redevelopment. So in the end, I couldn't find anywhere that had a long enough lease to make it worthwhile for the artists or for the space. And so we all stopped looking. I stopped looking and went to work at Matt's Gallery with Robin Klasnick. Matt's Gallery was in 10 Martello Street, which is a studio space for artists. At the end of the Second World War, there were a lot of kind of buildings in the East End that had been bombed, and then those that remained were fell into disuse. And so in the 60s, artists took them over. So this is one of those buildings. And so anyway, an artist called Robin Klasnick turned his studio into a gallery based on something that happened in Poland, actually, enlarged with an artist whose name will come to me. Maybe we can slot his name in afterwards.
Yeah.
And so Robin Klasnick showed his work and created this space based on what he had done in Łódź, which was the opposite of what usually takes place in an exhibition space, i.e. he gave the artist the space for 3 months and opened the show for 2 weeks. It's normally the reverse. So I became Robin Klasnick's assistant. And I did everything, swept the floors, wrote press releases, lugged all the stuff up the stairs, the materials with the artist, for the artist. So I worked very closely with the artist and Robin. It was a very intimate situation. Every detail I was involved in. And that's when I learned that nothing is too much, that the artist comes first, that you really work with the artist in a very direct and close way. We once spent 2 days lighting one painting.
Wow.
So that's the training I had in this very direct way. Also, each artist transformed the space in a completely different way. And that really stayed with me. That was my early learning of how to be a curator.
The formative years.
Mm-hmm. Then the art history kicked back in, and I was like, but I'm also an art historian, and I wanted to also work in a way that gave a more art historical framework, and also where I could actually curate the shows myself, because Robin was curating all the shows. So I applied for a job at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, now called Modern Art Oxford, as a curator. And I got the job. And so I was working with David Elliott, who's the director there, who hired me. And he had a really holistic approach on every level. So for him, a painting and a film were the same. It's all part of the same thing. And film was an art form. And he also had a very global perspective. So we did Magdalena Bakanovic show when no one was looking at her work in certainly Britain. We did a big show of Eisenstein films with the Eisenstein Museum in Moscow. Then we did a Philip Guston show. Then we did a show of art from China just after Tiananmen Square. We did all kinds of different exhibitions. We did the first show of art from South Africa, working with the ANC. Desmond Tutu came and opened the show. So there was a very strong global perspective, and also art historically, a very large arc of art history with the 20th century, not just contemporary. And David was also very non-hierarchical. So a lot of scholars would come to town to do something at the university, and he'd say, come with me, let's go and meet Baudrillard, let's go and hear Umberto Eco talk, let's do this, let's do that. And he threw me in at the deep end and really mentored me. And so that was a very kind of exciting and open structure for me to really explore. So I did an Edvard Munch show with the Munch Museum in Oslo, a show of early paintings by André Derain from the 1920s and 30s with Jane Lee, and then a video and film show, and everything was together. And the moving image, David understood as being very much just part of culture. And so that dovetailed with my growing interest in it too. And so he allowed me to do two, actually, was it 2 or 3 major thematic shows of the moving image? And I was working with 2 generations who were major moving image and also just performance and installation-based artists in the UK, and they had a lot of connections to the US. And so thence began my interest in what was going on here. And then working with Louise Bourgeois on a big survey show of her work really opened up that kind of dialogue between Europe and the US that I was very interested in. And so then when John Hanhart, the film and video curator at the Whitney, left to go to the Guggenheim, I was very proactive and said to David Ross, the director of the Whitney at the time, I would like you to consider me for John's position. And he said, I'm already considering you. And then he hired me, and he said, why should I hire you? And I said, because I will build you a collection, because you do not have a collection that reflects the complexity and extraordinary nature of the moving image in American art. And so he said, okay, let's try you out. And then there it began.
So how long have you been there now?
20 years.
Wow. And you've had an incredible career. I mean, the shows that you've created, the collection that you've built, it's I mean, your name is synonymous with a lot of incredible things in the art world. So you've had a beautiful career there. But I wanted to ask you a couple of questions when you were working with sorry, at the Oxford Gallery Museum.
Museum of Modern
Museum.
Art. It's now
Yes.
called Modern Art Oxford.
Yes. Because you worked with some incredible artists. I mean, I saw the types of shows that you've worked on, the types of people that you've worked with. I mean, that's incredible. But you also mentioned that you worked on the Louise Bourgeois show. Did you work directly with her?
Very much so.
I mean, I just want to ask this, and this is for my own personal reasons, because I always say that she's my art soulmate, and I never got a chance to meet her. So anytime somebody has, I always ask them what their experience with her was like.
She was extraordinary, very rigorous, very demanding of you. You'd better not say something glib or silly. She would rip you apart. The first time I met her, I'd been to see her show in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and I knew that she liked jam. So I went to the Rue de Sèvres in Paris, where, so many culinary stores are and food shops, and I bought her some jam. It was rhubarb jam, and I bought it for her as a gift, and I went to meet her for the first time in her house, and it's a bit like waiting for the Queen to arrive.
Of course.
And I sat and waited for her, and then she eventually came down the stairs, and then she said, "Oh, you are so young. Why did you get into art? Were you in love with your teacher?" And I said, "No."
That's such a Louise thing to say.
Then she started to psychoanalyze me, and I realized I had to turn it around, and it was like a test. So she had that very sort of French, like a sort of intellectual game playing that she liked to do. And so I realized what she was doing, and I turned it around to her, and she started to try and psychoanalyze me, and I sort of turned it around. And so we went back and forth, and she was very interested in Lacan. And so at a certain moment when she was bored with talking to you, she would say, "Et maintenant, nous regardons Jacques Lacan." And so she'd put this VHS tape on, black and white TV film of Lacan in his office in the 70s, talking in French. And I speak French fairly well, but I was lost immediately because it was Lacan. And then you knew she was, it was like bringing out the coffee. It was ready to go. But she took the jam and said thank you. And then Jerry Gorovoy, her wonderful, I'm not sure what to call Jerry because
Her
she's like her
right-hand man?
son, her
Yeah.
coordinator, everything, made lunch for us, made some pasta, brought Louise the pasta, and Louise put the jam in the middle of the pasta. And I thought, interesting. And all the time, she was a mixture of very playful and very serious and rigorous when it came to discussing both the formal, rigorous sculptural qualities of the object she was making, and also the psychoanalytical meanings and ideas around the body and the psyche and women and betrayal and love and aging and many, many, many things that she was exploring in her work.
Thank you for sharing that story, because that's wonderful for me to hear. I always love when people tell me like little anecdotes about her. Makes me feel like, even though I didn't get a chance to know her, makes me feel a little bit more connected. I also wanted to talk about the fact that you lecture extensively. So you have lectured at both academic and art institutions, including the Wexner Center for the Arts, the Whitney Independent Study Program, NYU, RISD, the School of Visual Arts, where you are the Faculty of Curatorial Practice Master's Program, and Columbia University, where you're also a visiting professor. Can you tell me a little bit about what you find rewarding about teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pedagogical environment is very generative. I'm not visiting professor at Columbia, I'm a visiting critic. Which means that I visit and have done for the past 15 years the art students every spring semester. And I have about 7 studio visits with the artists there from about 5 p.m. to 9, 10 p.m. So basically late afternoon through the evening. And I have about 45 minutes with each student. And we talk about the work. And what I love about that is that it's a very generative discussion because there's no agenda. I'm not there talent spotting. I'm not there to kind of potentially look for someone to do a show with. I'm there on a strictly pedagogical. I'm there for the student to be a sounding board, to be supportive of the work and the development of the work. At the same time, I'm not just going to sit with them and go, that's great, because that's not at all useful. Neither am I going to rip them apart. It's not about any of those things. It's about the discussion you can have about your creative process and how I can help support and develop and grow that creative process that they're there to work on. And in an increasingly, in my opinion, over professionalized educational environment in general, I think that if I can bring my very the experience that I learned from when the situation was much less so, it seems to be very helpful. The students ask for me all the time, and so that dialogue can continue way beyond the art school environment as well, or not. But it doesn't really matter, because to me it's about building community and also being there for the student at certain moments when they're really finding their feet and trying to figure out what they're trying to do.
Yeah. No, I think that's incredible because I mean, obviously, a lot of students need that positive critique, in getting their footing and their grounding, because you have years of experience of working with ex- incredible artists, established artists, but also, emerging artists. So I mean, your advice must be invaluable.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to value it a lot. And what I never say is you should do this.
Mm-hmm.
I really ask questions like, what were you thinking of in terms of what you're trying to achieve with this? And, sometimes it can be very practical. Sometimes they just want practical advice. They're really clear about what they're trying to do with a piece. And it becomes almost as though you're working through something, as though you're working on the actual showing of it together, because they're, it's about lighting or this or that. And in other cases, they really are trying to figure something out.
Yeah.
And I draw on all that long experience to figure it out with them, hopefully, or kind of, support their process. And the experience of working with such a range of artists of so many different generations really builds a wealth of experience that I want to share, and because then you're making these interconnections. Then someone's told you 15 years ago, or something that an artist has taught you, you can then pass on to that student.
Yeah. So how do you balance everything? I mean, you're doing all these lectures, you're critiquing, you're working, at the Whitney. You do a lot of studio visits, as you've mentioned, especially for like the Whitney Biennial or something. You did like 200 studio visits. How do you balance everything? I mean, your week must look crazy.
It is. I believe in work-life balance, and that's one thing. And I also have a lot of stamina.
Okay.
And that's another thing. So I think that, when you are working in the art world, or in any world for that matter, you're always searching for the limits of your own, not only ambition, but capability. And I'm not just talking about capability in terms of what great ideas you might have, but also how psychically and physically capable are you of withstanding all the demands of something very very demanding. And so I've learned over the years that the art world is a bottomless pit, and you can give it everything you have and it'll still want more. So you have to create boundaries for yourself, and you also have to pay attention to your physical and psychic health. So for example, when we did the research for the biennial, when we were traveling around, I do Kundalini yoga and gong sound baths and
Wow.
healing sound. And so every city we went to, I would find a Kundalini yoga center and a gong sound bath. And I would do it sometimes twice in 1 week if we were there for 4 days. And that really, I know, helped create a sort of counterbalance to all the stresses and strains of traveling. And it can be very draining doing studio visits. If you do 5 a day, you're absolutely wiped out by the end because you give a lot. And our studio visits were 2 hours each, and long involved discussions. We also didn't want artists to feel that we were being transactional in any way. So for us, the dialogue with the artist was very important, whether they ended up being in the exhibition or not. This is about an ongoing discussion, an ongoing dialogue with the community of artists. And so to look after your health, to look after your psychic health, to have time for your partner and for doing things that have nothing to do with art, I make time for that. I'm very disciplined about that.
Yeah, that's incredible. That you actually can strike that work-life balance, because I mean, it's hard for me, but I try also. How different is it working in England than it has been in the United States in the art field?
I mean, it's hard because when I left, it was very different, and now it's not as different.
Yeah.
It's slightly less different because, we're in a much more global society. I would say one of the main differences is that America is very open.
Mhm.
So in England, the first answer to something is usually no.
Okay.
I don't know. But in America, the first answer is, yeah, let's try it. And so I think Americans are very open, and they are very willing to take risks and try something with you, including funders. I would also say that in terms of raising money to bring art into the collection, whatever it is, especially with the moving image, you have a tax system in America which actually allows for certain things to be acquired as promised gifts and gifts, as a kind of tax write-off, if you like, that sort of charitable donation, which doesn't exist in Britain. And so it's more difficult for the British to build up a collection in a museum than it is for American curators. So, and I also think that the cultural history and history in general in Britain is just very different. However, there's something which exists in Britain which is very strong and very supportive of young artists especially, which is a non-collecting institutional network around the country. So for example, Chisenhale Gallery, there's a space in Nottingham Contemporary. There are spaces around the country that some of which have existed since the 70s, and some of which are more recent, like Nottingham Contemporary, which really allow, through government funding, pieces to be commissioned by artists, and that's also the case in Europe, and it's a case to an extent here, but not so much. So, I think there's more of a shared sense of a cultural heritage maybe in somewhere like England than there is over here, where all the museums except the Smithsonian are private. And there's more of a sense of a shared, maybe a shared understanding that culture is important, whereas here it feels like you have to battle to get that fact taken seriously, because the entertainment industry the commercial entertainment industry really dwarfs what's going on in culture in terms of resources, especially in the moving image. So a lot of filmmakers move into the art world to make work because they find that the film world is just too commercially demanding of them in ways that they're not able to, they can't make their work.
When you first accepted your job at the Whitney and you moved to New York, was it a big culture shock for you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
We're certainly divided by the same language. I think that the great thing about New York is that it's a great leveler. New York is like the ocean. It doesn't care about us,
Okay.
but it will take you as far as you want to go, and everyone will help you get there. If you want to surf the big wave, you can, but you better know what you're doing. If you want to stay on the beach, that's okay too, but it doesn't care about us. But it will allow you to do whatever you want to do. So therefore, you realize the level of your own ambition or capability, because it doesn't. It offers a lot of possibilities to try. However, you know, you'd better be resilient, because it's also extremely tough. It'll hug you 1 minute and slap you on the face the next, and it's not for everyone.
100%.
And so, but I thrive in that sort of challenging environment, because I like to be challenged. And when I left England, it wasn't like that.
Okay.
It's a little bit more like that now, but it's a little bit between. Britain is in a strange moment. It's, the government's collapsing. We're in a very post-Brexit. It's been a disaster, in my opinion, and it's not the EU and it's not America. It's
somewhere in between.
Yes, and that's not a good place to be. And so Britain is in a bit of a crisis right now, I would say. I mean, America's in a crisis too, but in America, it's a different kind of crisis where, in a strange way, there's more of a sense of figuring it out. Many of the radical movements in the US, be it civil rights, LGBTQ plus rights, women, the feminism, all these things, Black Lives Matter, everything, all these things really get forged in America first, and more kind of intensively than anywhere else. And so, you either want to be part of that, all of that, or you don't. And if you're in New York, there's a lot of possibility of finding your way. And so it's a challenge. And sometimes you'll go, well, you know what? It's too exhausting. I want to be calmer, and I want to live in a different sort of situation, and that's great. So I find it still a very, very exciting place, and a place where it's still a crucible for new ideas.
I love the way that you describe New York as an ocean. I think that analogy is right on the nose. And I also wanted to ask you, because you have so many years of experience, have you faced any particular challenges as a woman in the field in your career?
You know what the interesting thing is that I've been bullied by more women.
Wow.
In the US and New York.
I've heard that from a couple of guests.
And that really surprised me. And I think that it's something maybe to do with women feeling that they need to be as good as men, and then almost like reproducing toxic masculinity as a sort of way of becoming, because it's older generation women mainly, as a way of becoming, of being taken seriously. I don't know. It's a real mystery to me, but that's something I really noticed that I never encountered in Britain. I was very well mentored by men and women in Britain. So I think there's a lot of ageism everywhere. And I think increasingly now in America in particular, and maybe New York, which is where I am. So I'm really speaking about New York, which is what I know best. But I noticed that technology and the swiping and the glued to your screens mentality is creating a very transactional environment for women and young women, which is not healthy. The complete overemphasis on the visual, on the way people look, on a kind of almost distorted visual kind of assertion of how you look, that's supposed to be like OnlyFans, like whatever it is very disturbing to me because it's just not relevant, but
Yeah.
it's become very anxiety inducing for young women in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it especially in the younger generations because I have younger siblings. And it's honestly really scary because I actually worry about the next generation of, who are now currently children coming in and what they'll have to face, especially women.
Yes, I mean, it really sort of short circuits something important, and it breaks the bond between people.
Yeah.
Because it sets up something that's inherently competitive.
Yeah.
And we're moving towards such a precipice with AI and the climate crisis. We don't have time for that. And there's something very decadent about worrying about your looks when people are dying on the other side of the world in such numbers that really I also find very distasteful.
Yeah.
Because if you're free of trauma and you're free of war and you're free of suffering, is that what you go to?
Exactly. Is
You
it?
know, it's like really that's sort of like the last thing you should be worried about.
Yeah.
And the privilege that you have of not being in a war zone
Yeah.
is
I guess the default is vanity.
well, if the default is vanity as opposed to war and suffering, then the society is in deep trouble.
Yeah. Which, I mean, yeah, we're not doing so hot right now. So,
Right.
yeah. But I also wanted to ask you for your advice for incoming women, or women who are currently in the arts who just, might want to hear some words of wisdom. Is there any sort of advice that you want to give?
Always mentor.
Yes.
Work collaboratively. There always has to be a leader, I think, in a team, but those leaders can be several. So, for example, with the biennial B24 team, as we called ourselves, Meg and I were the curators. But when we were installing, at the beginning of every day, we would stand in a circle, and the leader of the team, the entire B24 team, was not us. It was the person responsible for the entire, for all the floors. And that leadership role in terms of what's every department going to do today, sometimes also that would change and move. So sometimes someone else that morning would say, okay, this morning it's going to be X person. And then, okay, registration, what's your bucket list for today? Not bucket list, what's on your to-do list? Art handling, AV, curatorial. We were just one of several groups. And the selecting of music for all of us to dance to at the beginning of, I think it was the Saturday before the show opened when we were all exhausted. We had a poll and we all sent in stuff, and then someone made a compilation, and our new director walked in and we were all dancing away. The bonding and team building is really essential. It's not about you, it's about us. And I think that leave your ego at home, because, anyone can have attention put on them for 10 minutes or 5 years, but it's really also about the long term. Some artists and some curators only have maybe 2 or 3 bodies of work or shows in them, and that's okay too, because in art history, if you're in a big permanent collection display and you're Warhol, you don't get any more wall space than anyone else.
Yeah.
And same with curating. If you curated 1 show or 20 shows, if you curated 1 show that's important, really important, and that travels through time, say like our Anti-Illusion show, which is the most researched show in our archive. I mean, those 2 curators, Marsha Tucker went on to make a number of other shows. The other curator, not so much, but it doesn't matter. What matters, it's in art history.
Yes.
So, there's the present moment, i.e. being together and being thoughtful and a good listener and sharing ideas and being generous and exercising good judgment. And then there's the very long term, which is, don't worry if your show gets forgotten for 5 or 10 years, then it'll reappear in 20 years' time. And so there's the longer arc of art history. So as a young person coming up in the field, it's also, what is the environment you feel most safe and happy working in? There's certain moments of your career, especially at the beginning, where you will struggle, where you will work twice as hard, where you won't get the work-life balance right. Because, I mean, I didn't for 10 years because I was too busy building something and, really focusing on that. What's right for you? And what's right for you is not right for someone else, and it's all good. So to really find your own place and to not worry about what other people think.
Yeah.
But to figure out what's best for you and to just continue honing it as a practice. And don't hop around from place to place to place to place, but really spend a little bit of time in one place, really investing time and energy in building something. And really it's like building something slowly. And certain projects and certain ideas and certain communities and certain moments, they have a particular period of time, and then beyond that they die, and then everyone moves on. So you might build something, an alternative space somewhere for 5 years, and then everything shifts and it closes, and then something else happens. But that legacy remains. So really it's up to you.
Yeah, I like how you think holistically, in terms of longevity, because I feel like that's really important. Because, like you said, sometimes you might work on a show and then it will get rediscovered 20 years down the line, which is sometimes how artists' careers function as well.
Yep.
A lot of artists, are not known in their lifetime, and then somewhere down the road, 20 or 30 years later, or even longer sometimes, that artist will reemerge back on the scene with new and reinvigorated scholarship.
Well, look at Hilma af Klint.
Yes.
I mean, who would
Perfect
have thought?
example.
She was so marginal always.
Yeah.
And she also didn't allow her work to be shown from, I think it's 50 years after
Yeah.
her death. And then look at that. At the Guggenheim, it's one of the most successful shows, if not the most successful. I mean, that is really a dramatic art historical kind of sort of a phenomenon, and you never know what a new generation is going to find interesting. And that's the whole point, is that new generations will forget, remember, reinterpret, rediscover. Caravaggio, after his career was over and he died, was lost for a considerable amount of time and rediscovered in the 1930s. So you never know what's going to come around again. And so the most important thing is to be present in the moment and to make something that's really important for the moment, and be ambitious for your work, not about success or, what people think of you. And then, the much longer arc of history, and to be also always working between those two things.
Yeah.
And in the end, we're just collaborators and contributors. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. We're just here for a short amount of time, and we contribute, and then we go.
Yeah, and our work lives on after
Yeah.
us. So make something that will live on after you. And you don't know at the time, of course, you can't do that self-consciously, but you, on a certain level, you really have to operate on instinct.
Yes.
And it's almost like having a musical ear. You have something, and you know that you have something to say, something to contribute that isn't driven from ego, but driven by wanting to articulate something that you've seen and want to share.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. If you do something genuinely and really from the heart, I think it shows.
Yeah.
And just leave the ego at home.
Mhm.
So I think it's time for us to head into the fire round of questions. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I will ask you to pick a number between 1 and 10, and then I'll read the corresponding question. So which number would you like?
3.
3. If you could talk to anyone dead or alive, who would it be?
I think it would be Boadicea,
Okay. Why?
because she was a warrior queen
Okay.
in England, and she stood up to the Romans when they invaded us, and she fought for her community.
I love a good, strong woman. Okay, that's a great one. Okay, let's do another one.
9.
9. What do you always travel with?
I always travel with essential oils
Mm-hmm.
and a booking to Kundalini Yoga and Gong Samba because everywhere I go, that re-grounds me.
Mm-hmm.
And I always travel with clothes that I love.
Okay, that's a great one. Okay, final one.
6.
6. What is a piece of art that you own that you would never sell, or one that is your favorite?
I mean, technically speaking, we're not allowed to own
Okay,
any
yes, as a
art
curator.
because as a curator, there would be conflict of interest.
Which I feel like a lot of people don't know, that curators technically aren't allowed to do that.
I mean, that only applies to if you're in a collecting institution because you have, you're building a collection. It's part of we have an 11-page ethics document we all sign. Also, I mean, I couldn't afford most of the art I would love to own. So,
I mean, if you'd like, you can maybe say a piece of art that you've acquired for the Whitney that you absolutely love, or that might even be harder to pick from.
that's harder because there's so much and it's so wonderful, I think. In terms of artworks that one owns, because we're not allowed to own art, I would say that I really love medieval and Byzantine art.
Okay.
And so the vintage books I have that show reproductions of those artworks
Oh, that's beautiful.
are actually a huge pleasure because you can open up one of those big books from the 1950s or the 30s, maybe the 40s actually, or maybe the 50s, probably the 50s. That's when most of them started to really be produced. And the quality of the reproductions, the way in which they show details, it takes you right into what artists in the past were thinking about. And so I would say it's a mixture of looking at art through art books of every kind from
Mhm.
every period, and also the privilege of being a curator and walking into a room of artworks in the museum of your choosing, or rooms plural, every single day
Must be an incredible feeling.
is an incredible feeling. And then that's why you want to share it with everybody else, and why you make exhibitions, and why when you see an artwork, you want to then bring it into being for other people to see in the galleries.
Well, I think that about wraps up our podcast today. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for coming and for sharing your stories. And you gave me so many things to think about and such great advice for my listeners. So thank you really for sharing everything with us and your incredible career that you've had. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And to my listeners, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys next week on another episode of the Art Pod. Bye.